Welcome back to the Fapstinence Podcast, where we want you to find freedom from porn. I'm here with my co-host, Kevin Ray Wilder, rather, and I am Peter Kirsting. And today we're going to be talking about practical ways to quit porn. In the previous episode, we kind of touched on why porn is a problem and why you should quit. So we're coming at this with the approach that you've admitted that it's an issue for you and you're interested in finding ways to combat it. Now, you may be further along that road more or less than someone else, so I still think this stuff will apply to you, and I hope that you give it a listen. All right, Kevin, well, the first thing I want to do is kind of talk about 5 things that we see lead to relapse. Now, this is not all encompassing. It's something that I think is true for a lot of people, and they're personal triggers. Basically, the more that you know yourself, the more that you can understand how to cope and not have a dependency on things. And I think that's a key word.
Absolutely, yeah. Because the thing is, with these 5 different triggers that we're going to be talking about, in some way or another, you're going to be tempted to relapse based on these triggers. So let's first define what we consider a trigger. So a trigger, what we define that is something where you were just going about your day, nothing was really going on. You weren't planning to go watch porn. You weren't planning to be tempted by porn. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, something happens, and then all of a sudden, you're just like, crap, I want to fap, or I'm tempted to look up things I probably shouldn't be doing. And it's interesting because a lot of times we will remember the act itself, but it's hard to take a step back and think, okay, what were the actions or what were the things that happened that led me to the point where I got tempted in the first place? Now, it's a really interesting thing when it comes to quitting is you don't want to be in constant flight mode where you're just running away from all these potential triggers, but at the same time, it's very important to identify which triggers specifically tempt you that puts you in the state of temptation in the first place. Yeah. So.
Right. That's a really good point. And I think this is something that we can both relate to because honestly, anybody who's decided, okay, I'm done, I need to quit porn, it's not healthy for me. I think I've talked to so many guys, especially, who talk about this vicious cycle that they run into. They're trying to quit, then they relapse. They're trying to quit, and then they relapse. And if you're in that spot where you can make it a week and then you relapse, make it 2 weeks and you relapse, that can be incredibly frustrating. And I think part of it is you're going through dopamine withdrawals, okay? So number 1, be patient with yourself. This is literally addictive tendencies you're dealing with. You're not going to be fixed overnight. But at the same time, the more you know thyself, the more that you can understand your triggers, as we just mentioned, the more you can start to fight it. So with that in mind, Kevin, we're going to go through 5 things that we think are common triggers for people. And the first one is anxiety and stress.
Yeah, so anxiety and stress, this is one that I personally relate to a lot, so it's a good one to start off with. Yeah. I think a lot of guys, actually, they struggle a lot, and this is one of their personal triggers because, when you have a lot of anxiety and stress, you just have this pent-up feeling of just like, this is like an emotional tension that you just want to be released from. And the way that a lot of guys end up doing that is through sexual release, right? Because sexual release, sexual tension itself is pent-up energy, right? Where you're just like, you want something to happen. You're kind of in this primal state. Yeah, you're already put in this kind of fight or flight mode. And a lot of times for a lot of guys' brains, I don't know the specific psychology behind it, but it really kind of brings about this like kind of that reproductive urge, right? And in order to be able to make that urge go away, if you release through ejaculation, a lot of times you have that you kind of sedate yourself, and then a lot of times all it takes is for you to just end up watching porn to alleviate that stress and anxiety once or twice, and it ends up becoming a sort of trigger, right? And it becomes this feedback loop. You keep doing it over and over again. It becomes more and more ingrained in your unconscious, where it's just like, oh, so you're stressed out, you want to relieve that stress? Well, you've already built that connection in your brain of the way that you do that is through ejaculation. So
Right. That's a very good point. because especially that last part, because it really ends up being subliminal. It's not like you get home and you stress out and you go like, oh my God, I'm so stressed out, I gotta go back. It's more like you trained your brain. This is what you do with habits, whether they're good habits or bad habits. You put yourself through a routine. When I'm stressed, if my reaction to stress is to go do something specific, then that's the first place my mind is going to go when I'm feeling stressed. And here's the deal. A lot of times when it comes to emotional things, you feel symptoms of it, so to speak, well before you have like the conscious decision to deal with it. So one of the reasons why I think it's so important to notice what your personal triggers are is because I honestly can tell hours before it's going to be an actual temptation to me that I'm going in that direction. And that was a really big hurdle that I had to cross, is to be able to say, wow, I'm starting to feel stimulated or stressed. And there's something about this that's going to make it challenging for me here in a moment. So what can I do proactively to deal with this? And so with that in mind, anxiety and stress are a good example. And I think we're going to have to throw depression on at the end of this one too, as a good example of something that a lot of people deal with. A lot of people have a hard time, struggle with, but the way that they cope with it is not necessarily healthy, because when you have depression, if you take medication, right, which a lot of people do for depression, obviously, you have to do more than just take medication to actually deal with the real problem, right? Everybody's different about what is causing your depression, but simply taking medication is not how you get rid of depression. You need to do things like seek therapy, be open with, someone you can trust about how you're feeling, what you're going through. And you want to avoid doing things like shutting yourself up alone with your thoughts, right? Well, if you're only taking antidepressants, sure, you maybe are in one way able to cope with your bad thoughts, but you're not really dealing with the root of the problem in that situation. And I think, Kevin, a lot of that has a similarity when it comes to dealing with porn addiction. There's something underlying that you're not able to deal with, in this case, anxiety, stress, or depression, that over time you've trained yourself habitually to turn to porn to deal with. What we believe is that in order to fight that, you need to establish, first, recognize what that is, and then find a way to fight it in a healthy way so that you don't have to turn to porn. And I think the key with all of these, the next four as well, is that you need to find a healthy coping mechanism, because otherwise you're just going to turn to a different addictive coping mechanism.
Exactly. That's a really good point, because when it comes to anxiety and stress, of course, it's relieving that, but it's also running away from it and turning to fantasy land instead. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of guys, the fantasy land is the fantasy of, sexual fantasies, right? Especially if you're a young man. And it's really important, like you said, to dive into the root of the problem and the root of the issue, so that, first of all, you know what you're running away from, because it is entirely possible, as addictive as porn is, it's definitely possible to escape from that addiction and then replace it with something else, right? To the point where you're probably still a porn user, but you're just not as addicted. And then, right. But it's still bad because you turn to maybe excessive drug consumption or something like that, right? Which is even more, like you take something like heroin or methamphetamines, the reason they're so addicting is because the dopamine high is even more drastic than porn, right? So whatever is causing that stress and anxiety, you want to really tackle that head on, and really just try to identify, first of all, what that is, and in what way it might actually be triggering you. We're going to probably cover a whole separate podcast on that specific topic. Let's move on to the next thing, the next trigger that tends to get guys to relapse, which is boredom, right? Yeah. So just a quick little thought on boredom before we get your take, Peter. In this day and age that we live in, right? We talked about this a little bit last podcast where, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have your basic needs taken care of: food, shelter, those types of things. Naturally, as a young man, you're going to be driven by your sexuality, right? If you're in your 20s or 30s, you're going to have your natural state. You're going to want to reproduce and spread your seed, right? So if you're just sitting there bored, not doing anything, chances are where your mind is going to wander off to is something sexual. That's not necessarily a terrible or bad thing. It's just something that is. But it can get pretty bad if you end up succumbing to the thoughts in your imagination, and then that ends up manifesting itself in you watching porn on your phone and going, delving into fantasy land, and then not actually interacting with all life has to offer, right? So what are your thoughts on that, Peter?
Yeah, well, I think you make a good point here that with boredom, it's probably one of the lesser nuanced ones, to me at least. I think there's some very straightforward ways you can deal with that. But a lot of times there's several layers, right? People don't have just one trigger. So if boredom is part of your issue, I think the real thing here is you need to establish some better healthy habits in regards to that. So like maybe more than just the word boredom, I would say excessive like alone time. Like being by yourself, like especially if you're an introverted person, you're more likely to turn to something like porn if you're isolated, right? If you're with a group of people, or you're outside doing something, or you're just actually like really focused on a task, you're less likely to turn to porn, right? And we're going to get to that in another section about how to combat some of these things. But I think a lot of time it's like the saying, idleness breeds contempt, or like what, I don't know, that's not the exact term, but idleness is dangerous, basically. If you don't have things that you're doing for yourself in your life, and that's not just true for porn addiction, I think. If you deal with boredom, there's a lot of things you could be doing.
Exactly.
that could really better your life.
Yeah. And another hidden benefit of Fapstinence, as we like to call it here, is that, the sexual energy that you have is creative energy. It's energy that you use to interact with the world. So one of the hidden benefits of trying to avoid boredom or alone time, just for the sake of, kind of alleviating a lot of the temptations that you might naturally have to relapse with pornography, is also the energy that you expend, the energy and time that you expend within the porn watching itself. You instead start to use that with other areas of your life, and you bet that that's going to have a compounding effect over time, where let's say that just leads to 1 extra hour of productivity, whether it be in your social life or your work life per day, where you're using that same energy which otherwise you expend through the dopamine rush that you get. And you bet, that dopamine rush that you get, that has a cost to your body in terms of the energy output that you have in the way that you view life. If you're able to transmute that toward life itself and in other areas, and share it with other people than just with yourself, that can really help to make your life a little bit more meaningful, and is one of those hidden benefits that ends up occurring from Fapstinence. All right, so let's move on to number 3. One of the number 3 things that leads to a relapse is the ability or the lack of ability to fall asleep. This is something that I've struggled with for most of my life, and I still honestly struggle with now, is, you have this natural temptation when you're there alone with your thoughts trying to sleep. Again, if you're a young, healthy man, a lot of times you're going to be horny, let's be honest, and a lot of times that ends up happening at night. And that, I think that's the time where a lot of guys end up relapsing, is when they're alone at night. For whatever reason, they can't go to sleep, so they just try to do whatever they can to make themselves feel good to go to sleep. And a lot of times guys make that connection in their mind, and that ends up being in the form of pornography. So
well, and I think this ties back to what we're talking about. Knowing yourself, your personal tendencies, and your personal hang-ups will allow you to combat this more effectively, right? That's why we're getting into this stuff. So you're right. For a lot of people, they have trouble sleeping. especially if you're an adolescent, you might find habitually, because of hormones and whatever else, you're naturally more gravitating towards something like porn to release. And then you're thinking, oh, yeah, I need porn to go to sleep. And we talked about this in the past episode. If you say you need something in order to do something you should already be doing, that's a red flag. That's a red flag that you're dealing with an addictive tendency here. If you feel like you need to watch porn just to sleep, that's addictive. So the real thing here too is, this could be happening at night. It could be in the morning for a lot of people. So if you start to journal down what time of day, how you're feeling emotionally, etc., when you're actually relapsing, then you can start to kind of create a map for yourself. You can be like, oh, wow, I'm seeing some patterns here. And I guarantee you're going to see some patterns for yourself about what it is. And we talked about with stress, anxiety, and depression that maybe you're looking for a distraction. You're looking for something to help you deal with an issue you don't feel like you know how to cope with, right? Similarly, with sleep deprivation, I think a lot of guys, I've even talked to somebody recently who told me just this, like, hey, growing up, I had a really hard time sleeping, and every once in a while I would just watch porn, and that would be my thing. And then I realized, well, I feel like I'm sleeping a little bit better because of that. So it became like, it was an innocent thing. It wasn't like, oh, I need to watch porn all the time, and that's why it just happens to be like this. It was more like, I started watching porn because I can't sleep. And now I'm watching porn all the time and I can't stop. And I still can't sleep. And I think that's the other aspect of this too. If you talk to somebody who does sleep apnea, like who does research on this stuff, a lot of times you become dependent upon something to sleep. So if you're taking melatonin to sleep, that's not a bad thing. A lot of people need to have some kind of something that tells them, all right, it's time to go. Especially if you have a weird work schedule, right? You work like a graveyard or something and you need to sleep during the day, or whatever it might be, something about your schedule is different. It can be really challenging to sleep. A lot of people have trouble with that. But the problem is, if you're always taking melatonin to sleep, or you're always using a white noise machine or music to sleep, what happens when you don't have that? You just can't sleep. You become dependent on that. Similarly with, for example, in the morning, if you don't know how to wake up and you always need a cup of coffee, how do you wake up without coffee, right? Your body becomes dependent on this thing. It says, oh, this outside stimulus or this chemical that's being added is helping me deal with this, so I don't need to do it. Like your brain, if it knows it's going to get a rush of melatonin at 9:30 p.m. every night, it's not actively trying to produce what it needs to sleep, to tell you like, all right, it's time to go to sleep.
And that's
Same
also,
thing with caffeine.
Yeah, and that's also part of the reason that your body kind of fights against you when you've built this habit up over 10 years or so. It's so dependent on having this certain trigger to make this certain state. Your brain's already kind of made that connection, that kind of rewiring your brain and rebooting it back to normal is a really difficult thing. It sounds like you have another point to talk about there.
I just love the fact that you use the word rewire, because I've been thinking about this a lot recently. When you want to change something about your life, you're literally like a hacker. You're going into your brain and you're trying to remove the wires and reattach them somewhere else. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. So for you or me to think like I can do that overnight, like, okay, I've decided I want to quit. That's good. Please continue. But don't imagine that you can do that overnight, because it's really easy to create bad habits. It's very difficult to create new good habits to overcome those. It's possible, but it takes time. It takes a lot of messing up along the way. And I think that's just something I really want to reinforce for people, is like, don't let this stuff defeat you if you haven't fixed it within a month or 2 months or 3 months or whatever.
If you built this addiction over, years and years and years, you're not going to just completely reboot and rewire your brain within 1 month. It'd be great if that was the case.
Yeah.
And it's going to take less time than it took to build that addiction, but it still will take time. All right, so let's move on to number 4, an unexpected stimulus So more specifically through social media photos or TV commercial.
Right.
So especially Instagram.
Or just a movie you're watching, right?
Yeah, any
TV
kind
show?
of media, any kind of visual media,
Right,
typically.
like-
Sometimes audible, but typically it's going to be visual. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in the age of social media, we're always on social media, especially if you're a millennial guy like us, you're probably on Instagram a lot. And you might just be scrolling through Instagram, just, looking for, just seeing what your friends are up to, or you've already built that habit of just going to Instagram when you're bored, which is a whole other thing that we'd have to talk
Right.
about some other time. But what
Right.
ends up happening, and this part is so addictive and so destructive, and a part that a lot of guys don't end up talking about or even considering. The social media apps, they profit from having you remain on the app, and so all it's going to take is for you to follow one fitness influencer, one fitness girl, right? That's just your type, and let's be honest, you're watching her and following her content because she's hot, not because you care about how much she squats or her workout routine.
Yeah,
right?
her work ethic.
And,
that's why I follow her.
Right? Yeah, because she's so brave and so courageous and such a strong, independent
Positive
woman. Right?
influence
That's the
on my life.
Yeah, exactly. But what ends up happening is Instagram sees this and they're like, oh, so Kevin likes this type of content, so we're going to push. When you go on the Explore page, we're going to push other influencers that are just like this girl, and then before you know it, your Explore page is just full of all these,
Just that stuff.
these
All you're
these
seeing is
sexy
women in yoga
girls.
pants. And that, we're not even getting, we are not trying to go there if you're thinking like, oh my gosh, Kevin and Peter are like being so anti-women right now. No, that's not the point of the statement we just made. We are not calling into question the integrity of the people who make their workout videos, regardless if they are, or just content on Instagram itself. We're more talking about how being on Instagram or other visual mediums on a regular basis, you'll notice a trend of this stuff is in your face all the time, right? And I think the Explore page is a really good example, because when I was dealing with this addiction, that was something I had to get away from. In fact, I spent several weeks going on my Explore page and actually like clicking the option to say, I don't want to see this kind of content. And it sometimes it was stuff that it's my problem. Do you know what I mean? Like it's a girl who's very attractive, who's traveling somewhere and they're doing something super cool, but that's on my Explore page right front and center. And it's like, well, I love exploring and traveling, and so that's why I'm seeing this kind of content, but it's always this really attractive woman. So because I am dealing with addiction, I am going to remove that from my page, not because this woman is like causing an issue for me, right? Because let's be honest, guys, do not make someone else like, don't victimize yourself. Take accountability for your own things. The woman on the other side of the screen it's not her fault. It's you. You need to deal with what you're going through, and don't be hard on yourself either, but I'm just trying to make that point, make it very clear. We are not judging people for what they post. It's just very obvious. If you're a man and you're dealing with porn addiction, sex is everywhere. And so if you're on Instagram, you need to remove that option for yourself. You don't want to make it harder than it already is. And you're doing that.
I do think that, and we'd have to cover a whole separate podcast on this. I do believe that, because people are going to do what they're going to do, but I do believe that these social media apps, Facebook/Instagram more specifically, is culpable for a lot of this stuff. Because, they know that sex sells, and all they care about is keeping you on the app. So they definitely do know the power of sex and throwing that in your face that keeps you on there.
Well,
but we'll have to cover that in a whole separate podcast. Yeah, I can go all day about that stuff. Yeah,
and we may have different opinions on this between the two of us, and that's something interesting to note in this podcast too. Is like we're not two of the same voice yelling at you guys. We do have a slightly different take on some of these things. Personally, I would say that absolutely the system in place is promoting that kind of content at you. It's why it took me weeks to just not see it on my Explore page. But at the same time, I would say a lot of that ends up being, end of the day, on me to make sure that it's not showing up on my page, or removing Instagram if I can't handle it, because that's bottom line, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's still definitely going to be in your control. You can do like what you did, Peter, of just, whenever that type of content's thrown at your face, you can just say, hey, this isn't for me. And then the algorithm's smart enough to kind of
over time, it
take
stops
you away
showing
from
me
it.
that stuff.
Exactly.
It's like,
yeah.
oh, there's a beautiful woman in that photo. He doesn't want that.
Yeah. Instead, they just start throwing a bunch of beautiful men at you. Maybe Peter will like this instead.
What is going on? All I'm getting is workout videos from dudes now.
Yeah. All these sweaty, ripped dudes now. I'm definitely not tempted anymore, but now I'm kind of suspicious as to what Instagram's thinking of me.
Yeah,
what has the algorithm painted me as now?
If you say sweaty dudes 3 times fast, it's going to show up on your Instagram Explore page. That's what we're trying to say, guys.
All you have to do is just make a few posts and hashtag sweaty dudes, and then your explore page will no longer be tempting. I assure you. Unless you're into that type of stuff.
It's like the South Park Biggie Smalls. Biggie Smalls.
Yeah.
Biggie Smalls.
That's the greatest show of all time.
One more thing on that point before we move ahead, because we do need to move ahead to the next point. I just want to say that with a lot of addiction, you have to remove yourself from the addictive thing, right? So if you're an alcoholic, you can't have alcohol in your house. If you're really serious about quitting, you can't have it in your house. So if you're addicted to porn, it's a lot more challenging because, like you said, you could just be going through your Instagram and see on your Explore page a lot of attractive women in very scantily clad or revealing clothing. And then same thing, you could love the show Game of Thrones. Well, there's a lot of nudity in Game of Thrones. And it's a very humbling thing, but if you're a porn addict or a sex addict, you're going to have to be a lot more vigilant about what is put in front of you. And it's not going to be easy because it's everywhere.
Absolutely. All right, so let's move on to the number 5 thing that leads to
Number 5
relapse.
on our list, sexual innuendos, right?
Yep. Sexual
and
innuendos.
Just having a conversation with somebody can trigger you on this. But Kevin, take the wheel on this one, buddy.
Yeah. So the thing is with sexual innuendos, it's kind of a little bit tied into the social media stuff, but all it takes is for you to consume some type of media where someone's even just talking about porn like existing, right? For all we know, your addiction could be so bad that if you see the thumbnail of this video and you know that we're talking about being porn free, just the fact that the word porn is in there, it's like, wait a second, I didn't watch that yet today. Let me go, So depending on your level of addiction, that could definitely be something which obviously is not ideal. But even with that, it's like where the fact of the matter is when you're interacting with people throughout the day and you're just talking, let's be honest, when it comes to guys and interacting with among other guys, making sex jokes, those types of things is kind of funny. So it's just naturally going to happen, especially when you're young and even just any age, right? We all understand the power of sex and how it's on our minds a lot, all the time for some of us. So naturally you're going to make jokes about those types of things. And one thing that humans can all relate to, regardless of what background, whether of ethnicity or anything, we all love sex because that's just a very human thing to love, because otherwise none of us will be here. So in that sense, all of us can relate to sexual humor, and because of that, it's going to be all around you, right? So instead of avoiding it, because that's basically impossible, just recognize it for what it is. And if your brain has created a trigger in your mind, or it's become a trigger at this point, where if you hear a sexual innuendo that kind of like triggers you to want to watch porn, just recognize that that's happening, and then just work over time for that to not be a triggering thing, right? But the first thing you want to do, because right now it might unconsciously happen, you might hear something of a sexual nature, and then all of a sudden you're fapping away, but you don't even realize that's happening.
Yeah.
So now just listening to this, just be aware that that might be something that might be triggering you.
Right. Here in the Fapstinence Podcast, we are pro-sex. We're not trying to tell people that sex is bad. What we are trying to say is that having healthy relationships, healthy boundaries, healthy expectations, healthy, that's what we want to see, right? And porn, I really do truly believe, is the furthest thing from healthy for your libido, for your relationships, for your mindset, everything else. So I think really what you're doing with this situation, what you're going to need to do is retrain how you talk about porn. And that's why this podcast really comes in key for me. One of the first steps for me when it came to being like, wow, yeah, porn is a problem, was me hearing someone talk about porn as an addictive thing. And I was shocked that somebody was talking about porn in a negative light. It's not talked about in a negative light very often. If you're coming to this podcast, you probably feel that it's important that it be talked about this way. But I also encourage you to change the way you think about and talk about sex and porn, right? If you find yourself feeling like you need to talk about it like, oh yeah, that girl's so hot and like just whatever, because just simply because you're around a certain group of people that you feel like you have to defend your manhood. I know some people feel that way. I know I definitely felt insecure about saying like, oh yeah, porn is bad when I was first going into this journey, because I thought, well, I don't want people to think that I'm like a weirdo or whatever. And I do find women attractive. I'm very attractive. That's why I have this problem, right? But at the same time, you need to be willing to say like, hey, maybe I can't be friends with those people, or maybe I tell them like, hey, you know what? I can't talk about that kind of stuff. It's not a good for my mindset, and I'm dealing with a problem here. And if your friends support you in that, which I think they will, might be surprised. That's really important. If they don't, get better friends, because you don't need them in your life.
You know, we talked about this last podcast episode. I think at this point, most guys have it's almost like a pretty universal recognition that porn is something, at least most people can agree it's something that you shouldn't be addicted to. There's definitely a debate to be had of whether it should even exist in the first place, and there's a debate to be had to defend its right to exist based on the law and all those types of things. But I don't think there's really not that much. I think men especially understand that it's easy to get addicted to, because a lot of them are addicted to it themselves. So a lot of times it's kind of like at this point, I really do think it's like, you know, if you're an alcoholic, I actually do think it's gotten to this point in terms of recognition among the younger crowds, just based on my experience of interacting with guys and talking about this with people, because I'm very open about my struggles with it. It's kind of like with alcohol, right? If you're an alcoholic, most people, if they say you're trying to quit alcohol, they're not going to make fun of you, because they understand in our society now that's an admirable thing to do, to try to quit. Because, you know, even though if they might not personally be able to relate to it, they understand and respect that some people might. And I think pornography's gotten to that point too. But that being said, you know, even if you still struggle to tell people about it, that's okay, but you definitely want to still find some people to talk to about it first, even if it's just in the form of online forums or just in my YouTube comments like this, just talking about it and being vocal about it, understanding it's a situation, identifying the problem. That's a big step forward to actually being able to free yourself from the stuff.
Right. And that's a good thing to end on, a note to end on here, because we want to hear from you. We want to destigmatize this journey of freedom from porn, right? We want you to find freedom from porn. And so on this episode, Practical Ways to Quit, we've been talking about recognizing your triggers. Anxiety and stress is a big one. Boredom. Needing to fall asleep. Unexpected stimulus from things like social media, TV, even just conversations. And so the next step in the following episode will be to talk about healthy habits and resources that we can use to combat these triggers we've just established. See you then, and thank you for joining us on the Fapstinence Podcast. As always, leave a comment below. Let us know what you think about the show. If you have a question that you want us to cover in a future episode, or if you just want to destigmatize porn addiction.
Yep.
All right, we'll see you guys then.